When I first saw the old trunk in my grandmother's attic, I had no idea it would change the way I saw her and our family forever. It was tucked behind dusty boxes of Christmas decorations, the kind with brittle bows and ribbons curling in on themselves like they'd given up on life. I remember reaching out to brush the top layer of dust away, and the smell hit me first. Musty cedar and something faintly metallic like old coins or forgotten metals. I hesitated for a second, my fingers hovering over the rusty latch, thinking maybe I should just leave it. But curiosity, as it always does, won. I don't even remember how it came up in conversation. Grandmother Evelyn had been quieter than usual that morning, humming a tune I didn't recognize as she sorted laundry in the corner. Her hands moved with that familiar precision, folding shirts into perfect rectangles, but there was a tremor in her voice when she spoke to me, something just slightly off that made me pause. "You always were curious," she said without looking up, "just like your grandfather." I smiled because I had heard that line before. "Curious isn't always bad," I replied, though I could feel a tiny pulse of unease. She didn't answer, just hummed again, and I noticed the way her eyes flicked to the corner of the room, toward the trunk, before she quickly looked away. I went up to the attic later that afternoon, alone. The ladder creaked under my weight, and the attic was cooler than I expected. Dust motes floated in the thin streams of sunlight from the small window, and then I saw it. The trunk, dark wood with brass edges dulled by time, sitting as though it had been waiting for me. It was locked, of course, and that should have been the end of it, but the lock was small and a thin layer of rust had made it brittle. With a quiet snap, it opened, revealing the contents inside. Letters tied with faded ribbons, black and white photographs, and a small leather-bound journal with the spine cracked from age. I inhaled sharply, almost afraid to touch anything, as if disturbing these relics would disturb something more than paper and ink. The first photograph I picked up was of a man I didn't recognize, standing rigid with a group of others in uniform. The photo had a sense of pride and fear all at once. But it wasn't the uniform that caught my attention. It was the way my grandmother looked in the background, younger than I'd ever seen her, barely out of her teens, smiling with a tightness in her lips that made me wonder what she was holding back. I ran my fingers over the letters, and the handwriting startled me. I knew my grandmother wrote letters to me, even when I was a child, but this wasn't her calm, looping script. This was urgent, almost frantic, in a language I didn't understand at first. Later, I would find it was a mix of French and English, remnants of a life I never knew she had lived. I tried to put it down and forget it. I tried to convince myself that these were just old things, sentimental trinkets from a past that didn't belong to me. But every time I went downstairs, I found her watching me from across the table. She'd hum quietly or clear her throat, and I felt the weight of her gaze even when she wasn't looking directly at me. It was as if she was daring me to open the chest fully. And then came the first clue, something so small I almost missed it. It was a photograph slipped between the pages of the journal of a young woman with a scar across her cheek. My grandmother had circled her own face in pencil, and beside it, in a shaky hand, she'd written, "She saved us." I didn't understand. Saved us from what? Who? The question stayed with me all day. Even dinner felt different that night. Grandmother made her usual roast chicken, and the smell filled the house with that comfort I'd always associated with home. But there was tension under it, like the aroma of something hidden beneath the surface. She asked me about work, about my friends, about nothing, really, but I could hear the unspoken between the words. And when she reached across the table to clear my plate, Her hand lingered for a moment too long, trembling slightly, and I noticed the ring she always wore, the one that had never moved from her finger, even after all these years, catching the light in a way that felt like a secret whisper. I tried to sleep that night, but my mind wouldn't let me. I kept turning the photograph over in my hands, thinking about that girl, about my grandmother's eyes in the picture, and about the life I had never seen her live. I remembered her stories of the war, vague memories she'd shared of ration lines and air raids, but nothing like what this trunk suggested. Nothing close to this. By morning, I had made a decision. I would know. I had to. I couldn't ignore the gnawing curiosity that had been growing inside me since I first saw that trunk. I took the journal and letters to my room, cleared my desk, and began the slow work of deciphering. The handwriting was difficult. The ink faded and smeared in places. There were names I didn't recognize, addresses that led to places I'd only seen in history books, and mentions of events that made my stomach twist. Each page pulled me deeper, like diving into a river whose bottom I could not see. And then, tucked behind the last letter, I found a map. It was hand-drawn, corners torn, and a small X marked a location I had never heard of, accompanied by the words, "For when the truth can be told." I froze. The journal had just stopped feeling like a book. It had become a door, and I was standing on the threshold, unsure whether to cross. It wasn't just history anymore. It was personal. That afternoon, I tried to ask her about it casually while she was folding laundry. "Grandmother, who's the girl in this photo?" I asked her carefully. She stiffened. For a moment, she looked as though I had cut her with words. That's none of your concern," she said softly, almost too softly, and I felt my heart sink. But her eyes told me something different. Fear, guilt, pride, and the tiniest flicker of longing. For what? I couldn't say. I knew then that uncovering this wouldn't just reveal a story about the past. It would reveal her, the grandmother I thought I knew, and the secrets she had carried for decades alone. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to open a door that could not be closed. The next morning, I woke up with that restless feeling that only comes when curiosity turns into an obsession. The journal was already on my nightstand, pages fanned open like it was inviting me to read. I knew I should maybe wait, give my grandmother time, maybe ease into it, but I couldn't. Not when the air itself seemed thick with unanswered questions. I carried the journal to the kitchen, sipping my coffee slowly, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator. My grandmother was there, humming again, wiping down the counters with that rhythmic precision that I'd always admired. I tried to act casual. "I was looking at some of these letters last night," I said lightly, keeping my tone neutral. "Do you remember when you wrote them?" Her hands paused mid-motion. The rag she held fell for a split second before she caught it. "I wrote a lot of letters back then," she said carefully, voice even, but I could hear it. The tremor beneath the calm. "I noticed some of the handwriting isn't yours," I said. "Some letters seem urgent, different." She turned her back to me for a moment, looking out the window as though the morning sun could shield her from memory. "Some things are best left in the past," she said softly, and I realized this wasn't just a story. This was a burden she had carried alone. I didn't push her. Not yet. But as I sipped my coffee, my mind kept running back to that map, tucked in the journal. X marks the spot. For when the truth can be told. What truth? And why now, after all these years, did it seem like the universe had placed this chest in my hands? Later that day, I began piecing together the letters. They were addressed to someone named Isabel, a name I didn't recognize. The first one was dated 1943, written in a shaky, almost desperate hand. They are watching. We move at night. I hope this reaches you safely. And the next, the supplies are hidden. Do not trust anyone in the village, not even those who claim to be friends. My stomach tightened. It wasn't just war stories, it was secret missions. There were mentions of people hiding, plans for moving them, messages about who could be trusted and who could not. My grandmother had been part of something clandestine, something dangerous. I found myself pacing my room with the journal, letters spilling across the desk, and a gnawing thought forming. Was she involved in helping people escape? Were these war refugees? Resistance fighters? I needed more context. I needed answers that the journal alone couldn't give me. By mid-afternoon, I was at the local library, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and microfilm reels. I pulled up articles from the 1940s, mostly small-town stories about ration lines, ration cards, and the occasional headline about soldiers leaving for Europe. And then I stumbled on something that made me freeze. A tiny column about a missing aid worker, a young woman named Evelyn, who had disappeared after helping transport people out of occupied territory. The article was brief, almost dismissive, but the photograph was unmistakable. My grandmother, younger, determined, proud, and entirely different from the grandmother I knew had never spoken of such things, never hinted at danger, never revealed the courage she had carried quietly for decades. I pressed my fingers to the photo. Could this really be her? The Evelyn I knew had never spoken of such things, never hinted at danger, never revealed the courage she had carried quietly for decades. The librarian noticed my fascination. "Looking into local history?" she asked, her tone curious but gentle. I nodded, trying not to sound like I was uncovering a family secret right in public. "Yes, just trying to understand something from the past," I said vaguely. Her eyes softened. "History has a way of hiding in plain sight," she said, and I realized she was right. My grandmother's history had been hidden, but it was here, scattered in pieces, waiting for someone to pay attention. By evening, I was back at the house, the journal open again on the kitchen table. My grandmother was making dinner, the smell of sautéed onions and garlic filling the air. I wanted to ask her directly, to confront her gently about what I'd found, but the right word seemed impossible. Instead, I said, "Grandma, did you ever help people during the war?" She froze mid-stir. The pan hissed on the stove. I held my breath. "Yes," she whispered finally, barely audible. Her hands shook slightly as she set the spoon down. I I had to. It was a different time. Terrible things were happening. I did what I thought was right. I felt my throat tighten. Her voice was calm, but there was a storm beneath it. Grief, fear, pride, and guilt all tangled together. I didn't interrupt. I just listened as she continued, explaining in fragments, leaving gaps that I could only fill with my imagination. She had been part of a resistance effort, helping people escape from danger, moving them from village to village. Letters were written to coordinate these movements. Supplies were hidden in barns, in attics, and sometimes under floorboards. And somewhere along the way, she had lost friends, risked her life, and chosen silence over recognition, a burden she had carried alone for decades. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the kitchen, almost hidden, a small locked box, similar to the trunk, but much smaller. I hadn't noticed it before. My heart raced. Could this be the artifacts? The proof of what she had done? Grandmother noticed my gaze. "That's old," she said quickly. "Best left alone." But I knew I couldn't leave it. Not anymore. I had stumbled into a story far bigger than myself. A story of courage, fear, and sacrifice. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just history. This was my grandmother's life, and the truths she had kept hidden for nearly 80 years. I spent that night poring over the letters and photographs again, piecing together a map of her actions, a trail of bravery that the world had never known. And as I did, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was responsibility. I had to know the whole story. Every name, every place, every choice. And I had a feeling that the next discovery, the real one, the one that would shake everything I thought I knew, was just around the corner. The morning light spilled across my desk, illuminating the spread of letters, photographs, and the journal I'd come to treat like a map of another world. I hadn't slept well. My mind had been running in circles all night, imagining the fear and courage my grandmother must have carried, imagining the people she'd saved, the risks she'd taken. I felt small, unprepared to step into her shoes, yet I couldn't stop myself. That day, I decided to confront her, gently, carefully, but directly. I needed to hear her voice, not just read her handwriting, not just piece together stories from fragments. She was in the living room, sitting in her armchair with a quilt across her knees, the afternoon sun warming the side of her face. She looked up as I approached, eyes calm but wary, like a soldier watching someone approach a checkpoint. "Grandma," I began softly, "I've been reading the letters. I I think I'm starting to understand some of what you went through during the war." Her hands gripped the quilt tighter. For a moment, she didn't speak. I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the pause stretching long enough to make me think she might walk away. But she didn't. Instead, she let out a quiet sigh and motioned for me to sit beside her. "What do you want to know?" she asked finally, voice low, almost hesitant. I took a deep breath. "Everything. I want to know the real story, the parts you never told anyone, why you had to hide, why these letters, these maps, why it was all kept secret for so long." Her eyes shimmered with a mix of sorrow and pride. She spoke slowly, carefully, like each word had been weighed and measured 1,000 times before it left her lips. "It wasn't just about me," she said. "It was about others, people who had no one else, families torn apart, children who had no safe place to sleep. I couldn't tell anyone what we were doing because if the wrong person found out..." She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. I reached out, placing my hand over hers. "I understand, Grandma. I need to know. For me, for us." And then she began to speak, really speak, and I listened, captivated, horrified, and awed all at once. She told me about the resistance group she had joined, a small circle of neighbors and friends who risked everything to help people escape persecution. The letters I had found were their lifeline, coordinating movements, warning of danger, sharing coded messages. She described nights spent hiding strangers in attics, transporting food and medicine under the cover of darkness, and the constant fear that someone would betray them. "There were times I thought I wouldn't make it," she admitted quietly. "Times I thought I'd lose everything, my friends, my family, my life. But we couldn't stop, not when others depended on us. Her words made my chest ache. I had grown up thinking of war as distant history, something my grandmother experienced long ago, abstract and far away. But listening to her, I felt it in my bones. The danger, the bravery, the weight of every decision. Then came the part that shook me most. She hesitated, biting her lip, and I knew what was coming. "There's someone," she said softly. "Someone I couldn't save. I carry that with me every day. It was my failure, and I never spoke of it because the pain was too much." Tears welled in my eyes. I didn't know what to say. "Grandma," I whispered, and she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She reached for the small locked box I had noticed the day before. "This," she said, "is the part I never wanted anyone to see. It holds what remains, evidence of what we did, what we lost, and the people who trusted us." With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside were photographs, documents, and medals, some awarded, some informal, given by those who they had helped. A folded letter, sealed, but addressed to no one, lay on top. She handed it to me. "It's for you," she said. "Not because you need to know for history's sake, but because you need to understand the choices we made. Courage isn't the absence of fear, child. Courage is acting even when you are afraid." I opened the letter slowly, the paper fragile beneath my fingers. It was from a man named Henry, one of the people they had helped. He had written decades earlier, after the war, recounting how her actions had saved his family. The words were simple, heartfelt, and profoundly moving. "You risked everything for us. You saved lives when no one else would. We owe our existence to your bravery. Never doubt that what you did mattered." I felt my throat tighten as I read. And then, finally, I understood. The trunk, the letters, the journal, the photographs, they weren't just objects. They were pieces of a life lived in courage, in silence, in unseen heroism. I looked at my grandmother, older now than the young woman in the photos, and I saw everything at once. The strength, the fear, the quiet dignity of someone who had borne the weight of secrets for decades. "Grandma," I whispered, I don't know how to thank you." She smiled, the kind of small, weary smile that carries a lifetime of memory. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "Just remember. Remember that every act of kindness, every choice to do right, even when it's hard, matters. And never forget the people who cannot speak for themselves. That is how you honor them." I nodded, tears slipping freely now. And for the first time, I truly saw her. Not just as my grandmother, but as a hero. A woman of remarkable courage, who had lived a life of quiet sacrifice that the world would never fully recognize. That night I stayed up late, looking through every photograph, every letter, every map. Each one told a story, a fragment of lives saved, of risks taken, of love and fear intertwined. I began to document everything, not just for myself, but to preserve a legacy my grandmother had carried alone. And I realized that my role wasn't to question or judge, but to bear witness, to make sure that the courage, the choices, and the humanity of that time would not be forgotten. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of connection, not just to my grandmother, but to the past, to the people she had saved, and to the moral courage that defines the best of us. I understood that the story of bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, tucked away in an attic, waiting for someone to notice. And I had noticed. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt before. The journal, the letters, the photographs, they were no longer just relics. They were a call. I needed to understand everything, not just for me, but for the people whose lives my grandmother had touched, and for the legacy she had carried in silence. I approached her carefully at breakfast. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, falling across her hands as she spread butter on toast. The smell of toasted bread and coffee grounded me in the present, even as my mind raced through the stories of the past. "Grandma," I began gently, "I want to help. I want to know everything. Can we can we go through the journal together? The maps, the letters, the names?" She hesitated, as though weighing the decision. Her eyes lingered on me, searching, and I understood. She feared the past might be too heavy for me, or perhaps she feared the world's reaction to truths long buried. But finally, she nodded. "Very well, but we go slowly, and you must promise me, respect what you find. Not everything should be shared recklessly." I promised. And so we began. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional sigh or muttered comment. She told me about safe houses, secret routes, the coded language they had used to protect identities. She described the constant fear that someone might betray them, and the grief of losing friends who were caught or killed. And then came the names, dozens of them, scribbled in her journal, often with shorthand notes or symbols. Some had survived, some had not. I traced each one carefully, cross-referencing them with public records, wartime archives, and local history books. It was painstaking work, but every name I confirmed felt like a small triumph, a life remembered, a story reclaimed. But it wasn't without complications. As I dug deeper, I discovered inconsistencies in public records, deliberate omissions, and mysterious gaps. It became clear that some families still had reasons to protect secrets. Not everyone would want the truth told. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized the moral weight of what I was holding. One evening, I brought the small box, the one filled with photographs and documents, to my grandmother. She watched silently as I carefully spread its contents across the dining table. "Every item here," I said, "tells a story, but some of them might be dangerous if we share them without care." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a faded photograph. She said quietly, "I know. That's why I never spoke of it. Some truths are safe only in silence." I nodded, understanding her completely, but I also felt a responsibility to honor her courage. "Maybe we can document it carefully," I suggested, "not to expose anyone, but to preserve the history, to remember what you and others risked." She considered this, her eyes distant. Finally, she said, "Yes, but you must promise me discretion and empathy. The past can heal, but it can also wound if handled carelessly." I agreed, and that night I began typing. I recorded her words verbatim, transcribed letters, and cataloged photographs. I was meticulous, aware that every detail mattered. And as I worked, I felt a bond with her stronger than ever. We were no longer just grandmother and grandchild. We were witnesses together, custodians of memory. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized I needed help. Some of the names led to families still living, and I wanted to ensure accuracy and sensitivity. I reached out to a local historian, Mr. Hargrove, who had a reputation for meticulous research. I explained the situation delicately, careful not to reveal sensitive names. He was intricate. He said, "If these are true accounts, you have a treasure trove, but you must tread carefully. History's delicate, especially when it involves living families and wartime secrets." With his guidance, I began piecing together a coherent narrative, a timeline of my grandmother's actions, the people she helped, and the moral decisions she had faced. And as I worked, I began to see the lessons embedded in every act: courage, compassion, and the quiet dignity of choosing right over safe. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, when letters hinted at tragedies too heavy to bear, or when I realized the magnitude of what she had risked. But in those moments, I would glance at my grandmother, sitting quietly in her armchair, and I drew strength from her presence. She had carried this burden alone for decades. I could carry it for her, at least in part. And then came the first real test of my resolve. A letter mentioned a family who had been hidden, but whose descendants were still alive, living quietly in another state. The letter contained identifying details. My heart raced. Reaching out could reopen old wounds. I realized that uncovering history isn't just about discovery, it's about judgment, empathy, and responsibility. I spent the next few days debating what to do. Could I contact them? Should I even? I talked to my grandmother at length, and she said quietly, "If you do this, be gentle. The past is never as clean as we want it to be, but truth is worth respect." So I drafted a careful letter explaining who I was, who my grandmother had been, and offering to share historical details without prying into painful memories. I sent it with the hope that empathy would guide the response. That night, I sat back at my desk, looking over the photographs again. I realized that uncovering history wasn't about heroism or recognition. It was about responsibility, honoring lives, choices, and sacrifices. My grandmother's courage was silent, but it had shaped the lives of many, and now it was my task to preserve it carefully, faithfully, and with compassion. I finally understood what she meant when she said, "Courage is acting even when you are afraid." Courage wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about accolades. It was about choices and about doing right even when no one is watching. And as I closed the journal that night, I felt a new sense of purpose. The story wasn't over, not yet, but I was ready to carry it forward, step by careful step.
A week later, I received a response. My hands were shaking when I opened the envelope, the kind of trembling that comes when you're about to confront something fragile and unknown. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. It was from the daughter of one of the families my grandmother had helped. "We never knew her name," the letter began, "but we know the story. Our mother would tell us fragments of people who risked everything to save lives. If what you say is true, then we owe her a debt we can never repay. Thank you for telling us." Tears streamed down my face as I read. I clutched the letter to my chest, feeling the weight of decades lift slightly. The silent acknowledgement of courage, the long overdue recognition, even if it was private. But the process wasn't without tension. Word began to spread, first quietly among family friends, then further. Someone had seen me with the journal, and questions started. My uncle asked about the old letters, and my cousin, always the skeptic, asked if this was some exaggerated family story. I realized then that uncovering the truth comes with exposure. You cannot reveal the past without confronting skepticism, curiosity, and sometimes judgment. I invited my grandmother to sit with me as I answered questions gently, shared photographs selectively, and explained what I could without compromising anyone still living. She was quiet for the first time in years, allowing me to step into a role I hadn't expected, protector of her history. Some neighbors were skeptical, some amazed, but one thing became clear. People respected discretion and honesty. No one needed embellishment. The facts, simply told, were more powerful than anything I could invent. And then came the moment I had feared and anticipated: the local newspaper. They wanted to run a story about my grandmother, the quiet hero whose bravery had never been recognized. I hesitated. Public attention would bring recognition, yes, but it would also bring scrutiny. I thought of the families, the living descendants, and the delicate threads of privacy we had so carefully maintained. We agreed to proceed cautiously, sharing the story without names or identifying details of those still living. The article ran a few weeks later. Local woman's quiet heroism during World War II uncovered by grandchild. The response was overwhelming. Letters arrived from people who had heard family stories but never knew the truth. Some were emotional, some cautious, but each one validated what my grandmother had done. Seeing her reaction that day was unforgettable. She sat in her armchair, quilt over her knees, holding the newspaper in her hands. She smiled softly, a mix of humility and pride. She said, "I never did it for thanks. I did it because it was right. But it's good to know the story lives on." Even as the world began to know pieces of her bravery, I realized the real impact wasn't fame or recognition. It was the moral reckoning within our family, the acknowledgement of courage, the lessons passed from one generation to another. I saw my cousins, my uncle, even the neighbors, pause and reflect on what choices they would make if faced with fear and danger. And I understood another truth. Sometimes the consequences of uncovering hidden stories aren't external. They are internal. They ripple through your own conscience, your own understanding of what courage, compassion, and responsibility mean. One evening, my grandmother and I sat together on the porch. The sunset painted the sky in muted oranges and purples. The air smelled faintly of blooming jasmine, and the faint chirp of crickets began to fill the garden. I handed her a folder I had compiled: photographs, letters, documents, all neatly organized, a lifetime of secrecy now cataloged carefully. "This is yours," I said softly, "for you to keep, for us to remember. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Her hands shook slightly as she took it. She whispered, "You've done well. You've done more than I could ever ask. Remember, though, child, the courage we carry is only meaningful if we live by it every day." I nodded, feeling the full weight of her words. Courage, I realized, wasn't just for the battlefield or the resistance. It was for daily life, the quiet decisions to do right, the empathy extended to others, the discipline to protect what is precious. I thought of all the families my grandmother had helped, the lives she had touched, and the stories I had uncovered. Each letter, each photograph, each diary entry had been a piece of a larger moral tapestry, one that showed me that bravery and humanity often exist in silence. And in that moment, I felt a profound sense of connection to the past, to my grandmother, and to the ongoing responsibility of remembering and honoring the lives entwined with hers. I realized something else too. Uncovering the past doesn't end with discovery. It ends with reflection, with the careful application of what we've learned. I had seen courage firsthand, understood its cost, and felt its beauty. And now it was my job to let that understanding guide my actions, my empathy, and my choices. The days that followed were quieter, less urgent. The letters were cataloged, the photographs framed or stored carefully. The journal returned to its place in the attic. Life resumed its rhythms, but with a new depth. I watched my grandmother move about the house with quiet grace, carrying herself differently now, unburdened by the secret she had guarded for decades. And sometimes, when the wind rustled through the trees, or when the smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen, I would pause and reflect. I would think about the invisible threads connecting past to present, the invisible heroes whose stories wait patiently for someone to notice, and the moral responsibility of bearing witness. Uncovering my grandmother's hidden wartime secrets had been more than a journey into history. It had been a journey into courage, empathy, and understanding, lessons that I would carry for the rest of my life.
Life settled into a quieter rhythm after that. The intensity of uncovering my grandmother's past, the late nights of reading letters and decoding maps, the careful conversations with families, it all became a memory, but one that left a lasting imprint on the way I saw the world. Grandmother returned to her routines with a newfound serenity. She moved through the house with her usual precision, but there was a softness to her gestures now, a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. Sometimes I would catch her sitting quietly by the window, hands folded in her lap, eyes distant, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I knew she was remembering the past, not with fear or grief, but with acceptance. I found myself lingering over the small moments, the subtle details that made her who she was. The way her hands would tremble slightly when she reached for the teapot. The way her voice would change when she spoke about courage. The smell of her perfume mixed with the faint aroma of the flowers she kept in the kitchen. Each of these little things felt like a connection, a reminder that the extraordinary often exists alongside the ordinary. The families I had reached out to sent letters of gratitude. Some wrote about reunions, sharing memories that had long been forgotten. Others simply expressed relief and appreciation that their loved ones' stories had not been lost. One letter in particular stayed with me. It was from a woman named Claire, whose mother had been among those hidden by my grandmother during the war. She wrote, "Because of her, I exist. Because of her, I know kindness is worth the risk. Please thank her, even if she does not remember me personally. She taught us how to survive and how to love without expectation." I brought the letter to my grandmother that evening. She read it slowly, letting the words sink in. When she looked up, tears glistened in her eyes. "I never thought that anyone would remember," she whispered. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but there was pride there too. I realized then that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures or public recognition. Sometimes it comes from acknowledgement, from understanding, and from the quiet knowledge that lives have been touched, changed, and saved. I began writing down the story in earnest, not just the letters and photographs, but the lessons embedded in them. I wrote about fear and courage, about the weight of choices, about compassion in moments of danger. I wrote about the human spirit, about how ordinary people could perform extraordinary acts when guided by conscience and love. And through writing, I felt my own healing. The anxiety that had accompanied the uncovering of secrets, the tension of moral responsibility, the fear of misrepresentation, all of it began to soften. I understood that I wasn't just preserving history. I was honoring it. I was living it forward. One afternoon, I found my grandmother in the attic, organizing the trunk one last time. She smiled when she saw me. "You've done well," she said simply. "Better than I could have imagined. You've taken care of these stories, and that's enough. That's more than enough." I hugged her, and for a long moment, we stayed that way. I felt the weight of decades lift from her shoulders, the silent burden she had carried alone, finally shared. And I understood the lesson she had always hoped to pass on. Courage is meaningful not only in the moment of action, but in the act of remembering, preserving, and honoring what is right. Weeks later, I shared parts of the story with my family in a quiet gathering. There were tears, laughter, and long pauses as we reflected on what my grandmother had done. My cousins, my uncle, even distant relatives all listened intently, absorbing the weight of bravery hidden in plain sight. And when it was over, there was a sense of closure, a shared understanding that we were part of something larger than ourselves. I often think back to that first day in the attic when I lifted the lid of the trunk and inhaled the scent of cedar and dust. I never expected it to change my life, to deepen my understanding of courage, or to bring me closer to my grandmother. But it did. And it taught me that stories, real stories, human stories, have the power to shape lives, heal wounds, and inspire action. Now when I see my grandmother, I see not just the woman who baked cookies, folded laundry, and told bedtime stories. I see the young woman in photographs, standing bravely in the shadows of history, making choices that demanded more courage than most of us will ever know. I see the legacy she left behind, and I feel honored to carry it forward. Life continues, with its ordinary rhythms and quiet beauty. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself opening the journal, looking at the photographs, reading the letters once more. I do it not out of curiosity, but out of respect, out of love, and out of understanding that the past, when handled with care, can teach us lessons that shape the present and guide the future. Sitting here now, with the evening light fading and the house quiet around me, I can't help but think about the way our lives are shaped by the stories we inherit, the ones told and the ones left untold. My grandmother carried decades of secrets, some too painful, some too dangerous to share. And yet, through it all, she acted with courage, compassion, and a steadfast sense of what was right. Uncovering her hidden wartime past was more than a journey into history. It was a journey into understanding the weight of choices, the quiet strength of ordinary people, and the moral courage that defines us when no one is watching. And while the world may never fully know the sacrifices she made, I do. And now, so do the generations who follow. I hope that by sharing her story, it reminds us all that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the small, quiet acts of doing right when it's hardest, in choosing empathy when fear surrounds us, and in carrying burdens for others without recognition. I wonder, as I often do, about all the hidden stories in our own families, the secrets waiting quietly in attics, the letters tucked away in drawers, the lessons held silently in the eyes of those we love. How many of them might teach us about bravery, resilience, and compassion if only we take the time to listen? Would you have the courage to uncover a family secret, to face the past with honesty and empathy? And if you did, how would it change the way you see the people you love and yourself? Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, or if it reminded you of someone quietly brave in your life, share your thoughts in the comments or hold them close. And remember, sometimes the smallest acts of courage leave the largest legacy.